we teach English webinar course, shaping the way we teach English webinar Wednesday.
Welcome to Shaping the Way We Teach English Webinar Course 14, brought to you by the American English Team. My name is Jennifer Hodgson, also known as Moderator Jenny, and I am part of the American English Team based in Washington, D.C. Welcome teachers from all around the world. Today I've seen teachers from Brazil, Mexico, Kazakhstan, and many other countries all across the globe. So even though we teach all across the world, it's great that we're able to connect, at least virtually, and support each other as a community of worldwide teachers. Here you can see the Course 14 schedule, and we have so many more topics that are exciting to look forward to. So, how can you participate in the webinars? During the webinar, you'll see myself, Moderator Jenny, and also Moderator Heather in the chat box. But we also rely on the webinar community to help each other. So during the webinars, you will hear but not see the presenter. The way for you to participate is by using the chat box, as you are already doing. This is where you can ask questions or make comments related to today's topic. Of course, not every question will be answered during the session, but there is a way for you to ask questions after the session that we'll show you in just a few minutes. Your presenter may also ask you questions in the form of polls. These are multiple choice questions that will appear on the screen for you to answer. We know that some people may experience technical problems, and unfortunately we cannot fix every technical issue, but we will let you know if we're having a global problem. If you do lose sound, a great way to follow along is with the caption pod, and you'll see that at the bottom of the screen. Webinar courses consist of 6 webinars, and during the course, the webinars take place every other Wednesday. Participants who attend at least 4 out of the 6 webinars receive a certificate from the Regional English Language Office or local U.S. Embassy. To ensure you are eligible for the certificate, we ask that you submit your attendance only at the very end of the webinar. So please do not submit it before, or we won't be able to count it. And for individuals, meaning you are just watching this webinar on your own at your own computer, we only need you to submit your email address at the end. And for viewing hosts, meaning you have a group of teachers watching the webinar together, we will need the viewing host's email address and the number of participants. You can see both examples on the screen. We know that many of you are already familiar with our Ning site, but if you haven't registered yet, please do join this site. You must register to join, and your membership will then be approved within approximately 24 hours. On the Ning, you can find discussions related to each topic, a page for each webinar, which includes readings and resources that you can read before the webinar, and then after, we post the recording and PowerPoint on the Ning. If you have remaining questions after the webinar, this is a great place to ask those questions. You'll be able to communicate directly with the presenters in their discussion. The American English Team has a lot of additional resources that are great for teachers of English. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of English Teaching Forum. Let's see how many hands we have raised. Oh, I see lots of hands from all over the world know about our famous academic journal. So this journal is written by teachers for teachers from all around the world. And you can also find activities that provide step-by-step instructions of ideas you can use in your classroom. So we hope that you will all read English Teaching Forum, and if you haven't, then that is your homework tonight. Also, we know that we have many brilliant teachers in the community, so please raise your hand if you are a brilliant teacher. I hope all of you will raise your hands. Good, I see lots of hands raised. So that means that you probably have ideas, and you should share those ideas. So please consider writing an article for Forum, and you can find the steps for how to submit an article on our website. So now for today's topic. Welcome to today's webinar. I'm excited to introduce the session Supporting Language Learning Using Smithsonian Online Museum Resources. The Smithsonian's 19 museums, 9 research centers, and the National Zoo span subjects from art and design to history and culture, as well as science and technology. We have 3 great Smithsonian educators joining us today who will introduce their online activities and learning resources that support English language learning. So during this webinar, we'll explore strategies for engaging students in looking at and analyzing portraits, as well as eliciting thoughtful questions about objects that help tell a story. And we'll learn how visuals such as collection objects, photographs, artworks, and videos with experts can serve as a springboard for rich discussions that will inspire curiosity in the classroom and beyond. Our presenters will show us how to search and explore relevant Smithsonian online resources available to both teachers and students. So today is special because we have not 1 or 2, but 3 presenters. With us today are Ashley Naranjo, Brianna Zavadil-White, and Naomi Kokion. These 3 educators work in different museums of the Smithsonian. Ashley, of the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access, develops online experiences for students that encourage them to connect with the world around them through Smithsonian-wide resources, collections, and experts. Ashley coordinates the Smithsonian Quest Digital Badge Program, which gives students prompts for learning through discovery, opportunities to make personal connections to the content, and links with various subject areas. Her experience in education includes research, academic curriculum design, school management, and teaching English in the United States and Ecuador. Brianna, of the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery, creates and manages in-gallery school programs, designs and facilitates teacher workshops, and develops teacher resource guides, and collaborates with other museums to provide innovative programming for schools and teachers. Brianna began her career with the National Portrait Gallery in 2002 while still in graduate school by facilitating outreach programs in schools and leading interactive tours for the gallery's traveling exhibitions. And Naomi, of the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, helps develop content for the Smithsonian's History Explorer website for teachers and teaches best practices for using these resources through teacher workshops. Naomi is passionate about providing young people engaging opportunities to explore the past and to develop historical thinking skills by examining primary source resources. So we're so excited to have these 3 presenters with us today and for you to learn all about the wonderful resources provided by the Smithsonian.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome from both Heather and Jenny. It's been great to watch in the chat box as everyone's introduced themselves and told us where they're from and what age group they're teaching. It's been great. I was especially glad to see that there were some teachers from both Quito and Comayagua, which are places that I visited myself before. My name is Ashley Naranjo, and I work in the Smithsonian Center for Learning and Digital Access. That's a central education office at the Smithsonian. With me today, I've brought 2 colleagues, Naomi from the National Museum of American History. Hello. And Brianna from the National Portrait Gallery. Hi. Today we're going to cover supporting language learning using Smithsonian online museum resources. In the the Ning site, throughout the discussion thread, we listed 3 resources. The first was an article entitled Teaching Yourself to Teach with Objects, and he walked us through over 100 questions that you could ask students about a simple styrofoam cup. There was also the Reading Portraiture Guide for Educators, which compares both looking and analyzing strategies when looking at portraits. And finally, there was also the National Museum of American History's blog, where a former educator shared her experiences with using objects and English language learners. So we're very excited and glad to have seen that there were lots of comments of people who had used visuals in their classroom and who are excited to learn more about them. I also noticed that in the polls, some people had never thought of museums as a resource for the classroom, and some people have limited opportunities to visit museums. So hopefully this session will be a nice overview for you on how to use Smithsonian resources that are free and available to you online. Before we begin the session, I wanted to share a quick video with you showcasing the breadth and diversity of the Smithsonian. Hopefully you enjoyed that video. And if you missed any of it, I know there was some fast-moving text. Please don't worry. The link to the video is actually on the resource page as well, so you can watch it again after the webinar if you'd like, or you can share it with colleagues as well. Here on the page, I have a map in Washington, D.C., in the U.S.'s capital, that showcases the 10 museums that are located in Washington, D.C. You can see that there's, right here, we have the National Portrait Gallery where Brianna works. Here we have the American History Museum. We also have other museums ranging from American art to air and space to natural history and to the Postal Museum. So as Heather and Jenny both mentioned in the introduction, the Smithsonian isn't just one museum. It actually includes 19 museums and galleries, the National Zoo, and also 9 research facilities. The total number of artifacts, works of art, and specimens in the Smithsonian's collection is estimated at over 137 million. Does anyone recognize the ruby red slippers and where they might be from? In the middle, you'll also see that we have objects as large as the Space Shuttle Discovery. And at launch, the shuttle with its external tank, the rocket boosters, and all the fuel combined had a total weight of 4.4 million pounds. I also noticed that a few people recognize the red slippers as Dorothy's from The Wizard of Oz, and that's correct. Those are currently housed at the National Museum of American History. The Smithsonian owns 35 million insect specimens too. So as small as just a little beetle is also part of our collection as well. On the screen here, we have a picture of James Smithson and a bit of a history lesson about the Smithsonian. In the 1830s, the U.S. was given a gift from a British chemist of his inheritance that he left in the will that he would like to found an educational institution in the U.S. for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. What's very interesting about this is that he had actually never visited the United States. So this was quite a philanthropic gift that he gave to the United States. Over the next 10 years, Congress in the United States was struggling between deciding if they should create a library, a research facility, and decided to create museums where we would be able to increase and diffuse knowledge and share it with the public. This is just a quick example of the breadth, again, of our collections that we have. The collections that the museum collects to symbolize art, history, science, and culture. Here's an example, too, of how you can use online resources to learn more about what the objects that we have. So, for example, collections database, collections.si.edu. If you searched for Abraham Lincoln, who is an American president, you could see a portrait, a life mask, you could see a watch that he owned, you could also see his iconic top hat. And these are images that you can look up online. Another important aspect of the Smithsonian is the research that takes place here. We do research with exoplanets, tiny bugs, and as you saw, we have over 35 million specimens in our collection. And we even have a tropical research institute in the jungles of Panama. Here are some contemporary examples of some of our scientists, including researchers who are looking at bats and frogs, snails, predators of the past with dinosaur fossils, and it may even be surprising to learn that even in our art galleries, there are scientists too who are working on the conservation of paintings and even looking at the bee populations and how a disruption in their population would disrupt the entire ecosystem. So combining both these collections with the research is the way that educators here at the Smithsonian are able to create learning resources. These learning resources are available online by going to smithsonianeducation.org. You can search for terms based on topic, also grade level based on age, and subject area. We also have pre-made lesson plans and publications for use. Here you can see examples of using the music and poetry, starting collections with young learners, thinking about the environment in your own communities, learning about the universe and scale, and talking about the intersections of both science and art through a botany exercise. We're going to take a quick look at another video, which I hope you'll enjoy. This video primarily looks at how Smithsonian experts share their research.
Well, let me just show you one of my favorite objects in the Smithsonian's collection.
There's some good rotten logs that we have in the garden here, so I'm going to see what we can find.
If you think about the Pocahontas that maybe you've seen in a movie or a book you've read, and you look at this Pocahontas, is this what you would imagine you would see?
We underestimate the power of the image. We see so many images from the evening news to music videos to films that we begin to forget about the ways in which images are powerful.
A few years back, I got a call from a gentleman saying, is there any truth to the fact that my great-great-grandfather engraved a secret message inside of Lincoln's watch.
We decided that it would be really great if we could get these leafcutter ants to pick up and carry our Smithsonian logo here.
Some stimulus comes in like alarm pheromone, there must be an intruder, and then there's a response like I should make some alarm pheromone too, and I should approach in the direction of the intruder.
The Wright brothers did not invent the concept of the airplane. The Wright brothers, however, did invent the first successful airplane.
This is really his notion of an artist who can do something and say something. They aren't just passive, they're actually trying to get these statements out there through their artwork.
That's what I think is so wonderful about museums. I think it can make history become a little less mythic, a little bit more real and a little bit more tangible.
I hope you enjoyed that video as well. I think it's a great example of utilizing expert knowledge to prompt students for discovery. Something that I think James Smithson probably could have never imagined is that now in 2014, aside from the physical space that the Smithsonian has, we're also connecting with students around the world online, and not just in the physical museums and galleries. One program I wanted to highlight was Smithsonian Quest. This is a digital badging program which allows for students to choose from a number of different topics. We have over 100 different prompts, and they all start from Smithsonian content and ask students to respond through writing or through multimedia projects. Students do research and think about ways that the content connects to their own lives. They also receive feedback from Smithsonian education teams, and these projects are great for supplemental learning. It starts with the Smithsonian experts and then asks students to continue exploring connections in their own communities. Teachers have told us that they've used Smithsonian Quest to explore interests of students. In our Smithsonian Folkways recording studios, starting with music, which is an interest of many students, we've been able to make connections to cultural heritage by thinking about different songs that come from different areas of the world, and also environmental advocacy, as many of the songs in the United States have to do with protecting the environment. Students build skills such as drawing, for example, and making connections to other content areas, and they try out new roles. For example, we have an online astrophotography badge, which has to do with using online tools to capture celestial objects and then enhance them and colorize them, which is a great activity that blends both science and the arts. I also wanted to share that we also do online events with our experts and trying to connect both the experts to students around the world. And so here you see an example that we did at the Air and Space Museum, where students asked questions of an expert that was live in the museum. You'll see behind the expert there's a huge airplane, and he led a conversation about flight and aspect ratio, thinking about something as simple as a paper airplane and then moving it towards the larger concept. And finally, we're incredibly active on social media. So if you're on Twitter or Facebook or even Pinterest, these are great ways to find about new opportunities for learning for you and your students. Without further ado, I wanted to introduce Naomi from the American History Museum, and she'll share with us a little bit of information about how to do an analysis of objects and use that in the classroom.
Thanks, Ashley, and I'm really pleased to be here with you guys today. It's inspiring to see all the different parts of the world that you're from, and to be able to connect with you in this way. Like Ashley, I'm especially excited to see that there are teachers here from Mexico, and specifically Mexico City, which is where I started my teaching career many years ago. I was an elementary teacher, and I have a special place in my heart for that city and the country. So with that said, now I am the manager of youth and teacher programs at the National Museum of American History. And our mission at the museum is to teach the lessons of the past to build a more humane future. And we do that in a number of ways, but primarily through the power of teaching with objects. So I will show you some examples of how to use online resources from the museum and some specific objects from our collection, but also talk about ways that you can use everyday objects in your class. So I want to start just by getting a sense. I know you talked a bit about this, I think, in the Ning, but here together, using this poll, I'd like to know how many of you use objects with your English language students. And I saw, I think it was Festa, mentioned that, you know, another way of thinking or calling this is using realia in the class. So, you know, using objects to help students learn vocabulary and other things. I also hope, as you're answering this poll, that you have had a chance or will have a chance to look at the blog post that Ashley mentioned at the beginning of the webinar from my colleague Jenny about using objects with English language learners. I think that blog post really offers the most compelling arguments for teaching with objects to ground vocabulary in visuals, to provide opportunities for building descriptive skills, and to allow language learners to communicate more easily as they build their vocabulary. So Jenny gives the example of, you know, a student is learning what the word for stem is on a plant, and rather than having to explain the green part of the flower that goes down from the petals, they can just say, what is that thing, and point to it and can learn that way. And at the end of the post, you'll also see a number of examples from your colleagues who teach English to students, and they have some useful ideas as well. So it seems like most of you guys do sometimes use objects in your classroom, so that's great. And now once we take away the poll, when the chat comes up again, I'd love to know, for those of you who do use objects in your class, how you use them, what objects you use. I think you know, it'd be great to learn from each other as we go. As you're sharing those ideas in the chat, and tell us if you can. I see, Yanine, you use fruits, so tell us how you use them in the class. But I'll go through and give you an example here. This sort of relates to another article that was in the Ning, the Teaching Yourself to Teach with Objects post, where you learned about some basic observational questions that you could ask about really any sort of object, an everyday thing, like a styrofoam cup. So, you know, these are the kind of investigative questions that the historians use to learn more about objects and other sources. And I should say, we talk about objects as primary sources, and you heard that a bit in my introduction that Jenny gave. So primary sources are the objects, the documents, the letters, the images that document a time period that were made at the time or by people who lived through it, like oral histories that help to explain that time period from the first person perspective, that are not interpretations by historians. When I say primary sources, that's what I mean: objects and diaries and letters and advertisements and things like that. So let's look at this object and just do some observation first. Let's look at that first question. What do you observe? And think about the kind of vocabulary that your students could be practicing by doing this kind of simple observation. And again, we're using this COCAN because it's something, it's an everyday sort of artifact to encourage students to realize that they can learn from many things around them, but also, you know, to say that you don't have to use museum artifacts in your class. You can use everyday pieces. So you see a can of soda, describe it. What are the colors or the images? What's the shape? Let's see. Yeah. So we see a can of Coke. We see red. We see red and white. All right. So let's take a closer look. Some people are thinking about what it's made out of, which is another important question. It'd be easier to tell what it is made out of if we had it in front of us, but just by looking at the image, the next image here will give us another sense. Does this look like the kind of aluminum can that we use more consistently these days? So Sanja, you say, or Sonia, you say tin. This is a good a good observation. So this seam here, we can see that it's got some sort of, well, it's a seam, a puckering on the side that might help us to understand what it's made out of. Do we see, what else do we see here? Do we know when it was made or used, or where? Can we tell where this object might have been used? If you take a close look on the right-hand side, you might be able to see where. Possibly. So you say 1980s Rose. It's close. So it's certainly before this time period. And this is a chance both to, practice those descriptive skills. It's a cylinder, or it's red and it's white. It's what it's made out of, materials. But we can also think about thinking about change over time and learning about American history and culture. So I'm wondering too if you guys are not seeing things on this can that you would expect to find. Is there anything that's missing from this can that you would expect to see? Yeah, and Gustavo, you're right. So Brooklyn, we see it was bottled in Brooklyn, so probably used somewhere close to that for the Coca-Cola company. You see diabetes, Oscar, yeah. Okay, so you could talk about that too. You could talk about health. So you expect to see the content, the nutritional facts, right? Yeah, so these are very good points. So so that tells us that this is not something we might, this isn't contemporary. So let's take a look at a more recent can. So now, what information can we see, or how would you describe this can? So can we tell the time period from this one? Serving size, it's more modern, just the style. We can probably see, has more detailed info, right? So this is a chance, if we wanted to talk about history, we could talk about when we started needing nutritional facts on our foods and why. We could think about differences in measurements in the U.S. and other countries. We could think about regulations, what's required of foods here or foods elsewhere. And we can see some change over time. So we can see that this, if you look on the right-hand side, this is from 1997. So again, we can begin with basic observational questions. We can help students understand how to build a question. What are the question words? Practicing those question words by asking, what is it? When was it made? Where was it used? How was it used? These are all the kinds of research questions that we ask about objects. And again, they're in that article, Teaching Yourself to Teach with Objects. But also we can look at descriptive words, as well as teaching some content and culture. So this is just a basic example, and to encourage you to think about the artifacts that are all around you. So next, we'll talk about a piece that's from the museum. There was a question in the last webinar about what the word nugget is. So I just mean this is a piece of gold that was found in California in 1849. So this is part of our collection, and it's part of a really important story, I think, in American history. So in 1849, California was not a state yet, but there were settlers there who found gold at a place called Sutter's Mill. And it encouraged an influx of settlers from other parts of the country and helped to expand our country west. And so this is a story that students in the U.S. would have heard about, because there are also related stories that are part of our popular culture. So a man named Levi Strauss was living, I think, in the Midwest. He ran a dry goods store. And he saw this opportunity after the 1849 gold rush to go and open a store in California, in San Francisco, to serve the miners who were there. And so the miners were doing tough labor, and so he developed a really durable set of pants that he eventually patented as jeans. So blue jeans were in a sense, part of that story, and they used to be called Levi's in his honor, and there's still a Levi Strauss company that sells jeans. Also, the American football team for San Francisco is called the 49ers in honor of the miners who were nicknamed 49ers for coming there in 1849. And so these are all things that students would have heard about and thought, and so may have known a bit about this story. And so we can ask them, what do we think? I see we have a Redskins fan. Well, that's good for the local folks here in DC. So we can ask them, how big is this nugget? And so this is a chance both to talk about American history, but also to practice your measurements, your size, your comparative language. So how is it an inch? Is it 2 centimeters? Or is it bigger or smaller than my fist? Is it bigger than my fist? Is it smaller than my thumb? So we can practice those questions. So genes, we're talking about genes in San Francisco and California. So yeah, we can use this to pique students' curiosity. And I think Fanta from Senegal, you were saying earlier that that objects are great for making students curious or to get them excited about history and also about language learning, right? So we certainly believe that. That's why we do what we do. So let's take a look. We've all had a chance to kind of think about the size, and let's see the real thing. So this, let's see the comparison image. So this is also an object we can find in our collection, or an image we can find online. And you can see that the nugget is not so much of the nugget, really. It's more of a flake. It's quite small, about a quarter of the size of a fingertip. And again, so we can use these images to pique students' curiosity, also to help them develop their understanding of measurement and size and that sort of vocabulary and comparisons as well. So just one more simple example of how to use images from the collection in your class. So next, I wanted to show you guys, and this in a sense to connect also to what Brianna will talk about later in the session, to think about how we can use objects, again, to build vocabulary, also to learn about figures in history, but also to talk about themselves and to introduce themselves to each other. So this is a portrait that was made by an artist named Robert Weingarten, who had an exhibition here at the Smithsonian a couple of years ago. And he was a photographer. And as he was taking people's portraits, thought to himself, well, how do I better represent all of the things that make us who we are? How do we talk about the things, the experiences from our past, the places that are meaningful to us? And so he decided to create what we call object portraits. And these are collages of images that together tell a story about a person. And so he asked famous Americans to write to him and give him 6 objects that would best represent them, objects or places. So I want you guys to just take a look and tell me what objects you see, what images, or just the feel or the colors that you observe. What do you see in this portrait? Okay, we see a U.S. flag. We see a ship. Great, yeah, so the ship is right in the center, and we see the flag up to the left. And Brianna will talk about ways to cut up pictures to help facilitate this sort of observation, but for now we'll just try to take it all in. So nice colors. Does anyone see, we see a spaceship, great. So that's a module up in the front. What else? You see snow, exactly, yeah, snow down at the bottom, which is interesting. And then up in the top right corner, does anyone see what's in the top right corner? The footprint. Okay, we saw it. Yeah, someone mentioned a footprint. So Neil's footprint. All right. So let's see, Bob and Jess in Mexico, you guys are connecting this to your prior knowledge. So this is, you might think that this is Neil Armstrong's, but actually it belongs to someone else. So can you guess at least what sort of role this person would have played in American history? Aldrin. Yeah, exactly. Nice, nice. So this is, this is Buzz Aldrin, who was the second man to walk on the moon. You'll see, so you see the references to space and the nation. The snow, I think, comes from an expedition that he took to Antarctica. And, he has spent the rest of his life continuing to explore the various reaches of Earth in addition to his time in space. So let's look at ways that we could use this with students. So here, for example, is an activity for kids ages preteen, so ages 12 to 14. In a classroom in the U.S., a teacher used descriptive words, decided to have kids figure out if there were objects in the image that were sentimental or that represented superstition or were sentimental, had them categorize those words. And the picture that you see on the right is from another famous American, Colin Powell. And then they made their own object portraits. So You see on the left-hand side, this is a student's example of their own object portrait. Again, they can practice just learning the words of those objects, but also they could create their own letter to Robert Weingarten explaining why these objects are important to them, which is what this class did. Okay, and next we'll see, so this is how younger students have done it, just to show you that this isn't workable for many levels. And these students do this at the beginning of the year to introduce themselves to each other with these objects. They select the 5 objects and then write stories about each of the objects that their classmates can learn about. And so we also see this as something that young students can do. So this is grades or ages 5 and 6. And these students are actually not making portraits of themselves. They're making portraits of other famous Americans. So this portrait, you can see a bus and a microphone and some religious images, and these relate to a leader of the civil rights movement here in the U.S., Martin Luther King Jr. So just raise your hand or let me know in the chat or give me a check yes if you're familiar with him and his story. I will just say that he is one of our more famous Americans, so perhaps you've heard of him. But the civil rights movement was a social movement that sort of the peak was in the 1950s and 60s that worked to gain equal rights and opportunities for African Americans to end segregation specifically based on race. And so these students have read a book called Martin's Big Words, which is a really wonderful book. Both Brianna and I have used it and know many teachers who have. And if you can get access to it, I recommend it, which is a story about Martin Luther King and his life using the words from his speeches, because of course he was a powerful speaker. And you may have heard his I Have a Dream speech from a protest march in 1963 here in Washington. So this book is one of several that we have on a website called Our Story, which is designed for young learners. And has activities that you can use for building language skills as well. So Our Story is designed to help young people and their caregivers, so teachers, but also after-school teachers and parents, to explore history together through historical fiction. And so we've selected picture books related to important topics in American history and have developed activities for them. So there are a variety of activities on this website for each of the books. Always we will have a reading guide, and those can be especially useful for you in kind of drawing out some of the language in the books. But also there'll be activities to learn from objects from our collection, so to take a closer look at some of the materials that we hold in the museum. Also, there'll be suggestions for taking a trip. So we understand that not everyone can go to museums or certainly can come to DC or to a large, to your country's capital. But there are ways to learn just all around us. And so these are suggestions for using the stories that are in your neighborhoods to teach young people. There are activities for craft activities, ways to use the web-based resources, and then more structured activities that study in school. And so if we're looking, for example, at thinking about nuances in words, so this language that you see up at the top of the screen comes from a national standard here, which obviously you won't be teaching to, but I pulled just as kind of a guidepost for us. We might look to this book, Mama Went to Jail for the Vote, which is about women's suffrage, so women's voting in the United States. So women got the vote here in 1920, and this book looks at the struggle that activists, who are called suffragists, went through to gain the vote. And the book is told from the perspective of a young girl. And at the beginning of the book, she talks about Mama is her mother, who is the suffragist, making statements. And so through the book, or through the reading guide, you're asked or you're guided to think about what statements are. So they're words, things that you say, but also things that you do, things that you wear, to give kids an understanding of kind of the breadth of the meaning of that word.
Naomi, just a really quick question. On the screen here, we have the word nuance. What is a nuance?
Oh, what is a nuance? I'm sorry. So it means like subtlety, or something that's not
different,
yeah,
maybe?
Yeah, slight differences, things that are not so obvious, I guess, or not the most obvious thing.
Okay, great.
Okay, so in the next, so for Martin's big words, as I said, the book is all based on the words that he used. So the reading guide helps to interpret the words and phrases in the book. Specifically, you can see on the left-hand side of the screen the back side of the book, which shows the title, Martin's Big Words, and big is in big letters. And so the reading guide, you can see a quote from the reading guide at the top, asks students to think about what does it mean for a word to be big. That might mean powerful, it might mean significant, and then to go through and find those big words throughout the book. So again, the Our Story resource that could be useful for you, and just giving you more ideas about how to draw out some of those lessons with these picture books. So let's jump back to talking about objects and to think more about the message of how we can help kids understand that history from a personal perspective through objects, and again to reinforce those observational skills. So let's look at these shoes and just tell me what you notice about them. I should say too that there is a sort of strategy for teaching called visible thinking, which asks kids to think about what they see, what that makes them wonder about, and then what they know, I think, right? Is that right? Or what they want to know about it. And so look up visible thinking because it's a really useful way, I think, of organizing observation. So they're made of leather, okay, they look worn. Does this make you wonder anything else? Do you have questions beyond the ones that I've put up at the top? You think it might belong to an older woman, or perhaps a little bit old-fashioned? Yeah, Demba. So we might think about what is the time period of these? Are these contemporary? Are they modern? Or are they from a different time? Okay, so we've observed they're kind of worn. So there's an interesting story to tell about these that we'll talk about here in a minute, but these also relate to the civil rights movement. So these belong to a woman who participated in a march in 1965. So the civil rights movement involved in protests on a number of levels. So in the courts, but also protests on the ground, so sitting in at stores that didn't serve African Americans, or marching on the capital of a state or the country, in addition to boycotts and other things. So these shoes, and the fact that they're so worn out, might help us to talk about that time period, and also to kind of imagine or to begin thinking about what the experience of this time period was. And we can, you guys can see an image from the movement of, this is a very famous movement of the march. And keep this in mind as Brianna gives you another strategy for using images and portraits. This is not so much of a portrait, I guess, it's people, but for thinking about using images in the class. But the shoes, we think, are a really good way of encouraging kids to think about the past, but also to develop questions, and also to develop kind of intriguing writing prompts. So this poster is something that you can download, you can print, and I think it does two things. One is it gives you those basic questions. So again, going back to our first idea about using objects, just to build students' ability to ask questions, to form questions, and then to respond to them. But also to think about, imagine life from the perspective of these objects or these people. So you see on the right some writing prompts. You could think about writing about an historical event from the perspective of an object. So either these shoes or any other object you might see. We could think about, for example, those shoes that are in the middle, they're kind of brown. Those are made out of iron, and they belonged to a chemist in the 16th or 17th century. And so we could think about, well, what was the world like then? Could imagine him in his lab. We could also write about the person behind the shoes for not so much a creative writing activity, but a research activity, and again, could learn more about American history. There's always the ruby slippers if you want to write about Dorothy and imagine that, but also below those are Abigail Adams' shoes. Abigail Adams was the wife of one of the leaders of the American Revolution. And so we can wonder, well, what did the revolution look like from the perspective of her feet? Where did she go, and what did she see, and what did she do? We can also use shoes, personal objects, as writing prompts for students to talk about themselves, just like in the object portrait. So, what do the things that we wear, the way that they're made, when they're made, or where they're made, what do they say about us and the time in which we live? So, all things that you can use to get kids writing and thinking and talking and practicing their vocabulary and sentence structures. So there are lots of other resources that can help you build these questioning skills with students. One of them is a resource that we have on our website, which I'll show you in just a minute, called Engaging Students with Primary Sources. Again, primary sources being that original material made at the time period, images, objects, documents. And so this guide has suggestions for teaching with these different types of sources, including questions that you can give to students or structured activities around primary sources, also suggestions for places to find them. So, we get objects all kinds of places. We buy them online, we get them from our own attics or our basements or other places, but this will give you suggestions for other ways to find resources. And you can find all of these on Smithsonian's History Explorer. I want to say that this website is specifically for the National Museum of American History. You don't have to teach American history to use the resources here. There are, in addition to lesson plans, lots of objects that you could pull out and just use them for, for description and engagement. I'll show you how this website works. If you can see that under the word explore, there's a little bar or a space that's for keywords. So you can do a search if you're looking for images or resources around transportation or music, you can search there. But there are also below that some other ways to search or to filter your resources. So you can search by resource type. So there are lessons and activities, which are paper-based things, interactives and media, so videos and audio, as well as online games, and then museum artifacts, which are images of pieces from the collection. But you'll also see, you can also search by historical era. But below that, you'll see cross-curricular connections, and we have a drop-down there to show you, and that means sort of we're looking at social studies plus other types of other subjects to teach. So math, reading, for example, or writing. So these, if you search by those, you'll more likely find the kinds of activities that we've talked about today. You'll also note that up at the top, you can find a tab that's teacher resources. So go there to find the Engaging Students with Primary Sources resource and some other articles for you to guide you in teaching with objects. So I really hope that these will be useful to you. You can find us on social media, and all of those social media links are on History Explorer. But you can also email me and my team directly at historyteachers@si.edu, and if that's not in the name already, we can add it. So thanks very much, and I'll pass it to Brianna for some really fantastic activities for pulling apart these sort of looking strategies.
Thanks, Naomi. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Brianna White, and I manage the school and teacher programs for the National Portrait Gallery. And as you saw, the National Portrait Gallery, when Ashley was talking, is one of the museums that is off the mall. The Portrait Gallery has a very clear mission. We tell the story of America through the people who have shaped it. And so our collection is comprised solely of portraits. And so we define a portrait as a likeness of an individual, so a picture of a person. And so we consider ourselves to be a history, biography, and art museum. And the way in which we use the portraits in our collection across the board with students as young as 3 years old and as old as 99 years old, is to think about what we see in the portrait and how what we see can lead us into a conversation about the biography of the sitter and the history of that time period. Very quickly, I will say this a lot in the next half hour, the sitter is the person in the portrait. The artist is the person who created the portrait, and of course the portrait is the object itself, and again it is the likeness of an individual. So inquiry. Inquiry is really the foundation of our programming, because everything that we do when we're looking at portraits is about a conversation. So I'm wondering if I could get a show of hands, how many of you are using artwork in the classroom already? Just raise your hand if you use artwork. Okay. So I'm seeing a lot of hands in the air, which is fantastic. And what I hope to do is introduce you to strategies that we use with portraits, but that you don't have to use with just portraits. They can be used with really any artwork. And you just need to think about how to adapt it depending on what it is you're looking at with your students. I should also say that the strategies that I'm going to introduce you to can be used across the board. You will need to adapt them. You know, for students who are young versus students in university, the kinds of questions that you ask will certainly vary. You might get more in-depth questions with university or, you know, later teenage year students versus elementary school students who are ages 6 to 12. So, reading portraiture. This is how we do what we do, reading portraiture. So what do you think it means to read a portrait? Okay, so I'm seeing someone that has used this idea to prompt speaking, absolutely. Description, interpretation, identifying specific things, absolutely. And when we think about reading portraits at the portrait gallery, we think about reading the object like you would read a biography or you would read an autobiography. When you read biographies and autobiographies, you're learning about the characters and you're learning about his or her contributions. And so we really feel that you can take a look at an image of an individual, and on the screen are just examples from our collection, and you can learn about that individual, that sitter in the portrait. And so the question is how do we do that? And how we do that is through the elements of portrayal. And these elements are visual elements. So when you think about questions that you might pose to your students, what sort of visual things do we need to tease out? Do we need to discuss if we want to learn about this portrait, the person in the portrait, the people in the portrait? So I'm seeing right from the get-go, Renee in Honduras is saying that this is a portrait of Rosa Parks. It absolutely is. How many of you know who Rosa Parks is? You can raise your hand. Okay, so many of you know. Rosa Parks was a civil rights activist at the same time as Martin Luther King, who Naomi was talking about just a little bit ago. And she, on December 1st, 1955, would not give up her seat on a Montgomery bus, a public bus, to a white person. And so she was arrested, and that action began a 382-day bus boycott, which takes us into 1956. And so what you're seeing is a booking photograph. And so back to the elements of portrayal. The things that I've seen coming up are that it's a photograph, it's black and white, People have commented on the pose and the posture. So the way that she is standing, the action that she's participating in. We have to consider setting, the question of where is she in this portrait? What other things should we tease out? Yes, hair, absolutely. This hairstyle is not something that we would typically see today, but is very clearly part of the 1950s. As well as clothing, yes, both on the part of Rosa Parks as well as the police officer. If the police officer were not wearing a uniform, we might have a very different idea about what is going on in this portrait. Okay. So the elements of portrayal that we always need to think about when looking at a portrait are exactly what's on the screen. When we think about our sitter, we have to think about the pose that they're in, as well as their expression. You also need to think about the hairstyle and the clothing, because both of those can help us determine era, the time in which the person lived. Color, we talked about this just a minute ago. This is a black and white photograph. It would have a very different feel to it if it were in color. And so when we think about color, we also have to think about medium, which is the materials used to create the portrait. And so at the Portrait Gallery, we collect portraits that are paintings and sculpture, photographs, prints, and drawings, video portraits now. So many different types of portraits. But two other elements are so incredibly important when you are looking at portraits and you're trying to decode them. One is the setting. Where is the sitter? And sometimes you know, and sometimes you don't. And then the objects. And again, this is such a nice tie-in with what Naomi was talking about with the object portrait. Objects are so crucial, because they're there to tell you something about your sitter. They're not just there for the sake of being there. And so sometimes it's generic and sometimes it's specific to our individual. So what I'd like to do for the next few minutes is model some of the strategies that we like to use when looking at portraits with students, with teachers, with visitors in the museum. So this first strategy is called the 30-second look. I'm going to give you 30 seconds to look at this portrait. I'd like you to look from top to bottom, side to side, all around. Take in as many of the visual details as you can. And then in another 15 seconds, we're going to take the image, the portrait, off of the screen, and we're going to have a conversation about what you saw. 10 more seconds. Okay. So I'm already seeing lots and lots of wonderful responses in the chat box. Yes, it is absolutely George Washington, who was the first president of the United States. Was Washington seated or was he standing? Okay. Yes, he was absolutely standing. And in this portrait, there are two pieces of furniture. What are they? Okay, a desk or a table and a chair. Let's talk about the chair first. On the back and the seat of the chair was a fabric. What color was it? And if you could touch it, what do you think it's going to feel like? Okay, absolutely. So it's a red, some people are saying orange, a brown. It's a deep, rich red color, and I'm getting a ton of responses that if you could touch it, it's going to feel like velvet. And at the top of the chair, there is an emblem, a symbol. What was it? Absolutely. So I have a response that it was a flag. Again, another response that it was an American flag, yes. And specifically, there were 13 stars and 13 stripes representing the original 13 states. Okay, let's move over to the table. What did you see on top of the table and underneath of the table? Okay, so a quill pen and an inkwell, books, papers, books underneath of the table, a red cloth, fantastic. These are exactly all the things. Raise your hand if you saw a black hat. Okay, I'm seeing a lot of hands raised. Absolutely. Tell me about the sky behind George Washington. What did you notice? Yes, absolutely. Zarima says that it was blue, but there were also clouds and a rainbow. Diego says that there was a rainbow. Absolutely. So there is an awful lot going on in the sky behind Washington. We have this wonderful rainbow that absolutely stands out, but we also have blue sky and dark clouds and rays of light. So there's certainly a lot to take in. And then just one final question, which might be a little bit tricky. In this portrait, there are two different types of animals. What are they? Okay, somebody has said an eagle. There is absolutely an eagle. I'm also seeing a cat and a horse and birds. I'm not sure about those. I do. Sandra from Bolivia says a dog. There is absolutely a dog. So here is the image again. And you'd have to look very, very, very closely to see that the inkwell that's sitting on the table, the base of the inkwell is held up by two reclining dogs. And then on the table leg, there are two eagles, again, which represent the United States. So the beauty about the 30-second look is the fact that students have to closely look on their own. They have to rely on their own observation skills. But when they turn away, it very much becomes a conversation and a challenge among everyone. What I see more often than not is people trying to piece together the image in their head when they're turned away from the portrait. And so when you are turned away from the piece, you as the facilitator are having a conversation with your students about those elements of portrayal. It's all about the visual observation, okay? But when you turn back and when you have the portrait again on the screen, that's when you can go into and discuss more in depth the interpretation. It goes back to what Ashley mentioned earlier in the Reading Portraiture Guide for Educators, is that we have to look before we can analyze. Because how can we analyze something that we first have not identified? Okay. Take a look at this portrait of George Washington Carver, who was a scientist during the early part of the 20th century. And you'll notice on the screen it says jumping in. And so this happens to be one of my favorite strategies that I like to utilize in the museum, because it allows people the opportunity to think about what it must feel like and be like to be within the portrait, and works incredibly well when you have an object that has a rich setting and a lot going on in it. And so the idea is that students, they decide where they're going to jump in. They can be as big as they want to be, they can be as small as they want to be, but when they get there, they need to consider the five senses, okay? So if you were going to jump into this portrait, where would you jump in? I'm going to give you about, there, perfect, thank you. We've put a poll, take about, so you see that there's a poll up on the screen. If you could jump into this portrait, where would you go? The man's shoulder? Would you go into the dirt in the potted plant? Are you going to jump into the tree behind George Washington Carver? Might you actually jump into the flower? The flower seems to be pretty popular. And secondary to that, in the tree. Excellent. Okay, let's go back to the portrait. So tell me where you jumped into the portrait, and more importantly, why you jumped into that spot. Oh, I've never heard that before. JP says that he jumped into the sky. That's very cool. And I love the sky behind Carver because it is not only blue, but we also have that wonderful area of light. Okay, a lot of people are jumping into the flower because it is pretty. Elizabeth says, again, in the flower because it seems like a nice place. Somebody mentioned into the tree because there is a wonderful view from that place. Absolutely. And so what jumping into the portrait does, when you think about your five senses, is it leads us into a conversation about what Carver is doing. So as you look at this portrait, what does it look like he's doing? Okay, Zarima says that he's studying the flower. Others have said fixing the flower, taking care of the flower, observing the flower, nurturing it. Absolutely, he is doing all of those things. You remember what I said a little while ago, that Carver was a scientist. And so how we remember him is because he created, and this is a huge number, he created over 400 different uses for peanuts and sweet potatoes. He was really the one that got us thinking about peanut butter, which people often don't think about. But he had a hobby. We all have hobbies. And of course, his hobby had something to do with science. He created a hybrid amaryllis. And that amaryllis is the flower that you see in the portrait. So if you notice, he's working on one that is both white and that pink-red color, but next to it is one that's red, and on the other side of him, there's one that's white, which I think is pretty cool, that we get to see Carver in the actual act of doing something scientific. I want to point out here that jumping in, this idea of considering your five senses, winds up being such a wonderful writing prompt for students. Because if you're not having the conversation, they can certainly write about what it feels like to be in this portrait, and perhaps it becomes an adventure story. What kinds of crazy adventures can they go on once they've jumped into this piece? What would George Washington Carver say to them if they were in the portrait? Would he be singing? Would he be talking about the process of doing what he's doing? So there are tons of different options. And again, depending on the level of students that you're teaching, you can adapt jumping in to their grade level. Okay. We saw these two portraits in the second video that Ashley showed us earlier. And one of the wonderful strategies that we like to use is compare and contrast. So with compare and contrast, you have two portraits of the same individual. And they don't necessarily have to be like they are in this portrait. They can be two portraits of an individual over time. We often think about Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, and we think about how he looked at the beginning of the Civil War and then how he looked at the end of the Civil War. But with these particular portraits of Pocahontas, they are both images of Pocahontas. One was created from life, and one is a copy based on the one created from life. And so when I say created from life, I mean that Pocahontas, the Native American who lived in Virginia during colonial America in the early 1600s, she actually sat for the portrait. So there's the connection between the artist and the sitter. So when you think about comparing, what sorts of similarities and differences do you see between these two objects? Okay, Pedro is saying that one is in color and one is in black and white. Absolutely. We see a difference, but we think it's in age. And the reason for that is because in the engraving, Pocahontas looks older because of the very defined features. And then in the painting, she looks younger, fuller. This also could be because, again, the painting is in color and the engraving is in black and white. Materials was mentioned. Absolutely. There's a huge difference in the way that these pieces were created. The composition of the portrait, we see that in the engraving that the composition is elongated, whereas in the painting the composition is sort of squished a little bit, so it's wider. And that changes the way in which we view the piece, certainly. Might have something to do too with the way that we see, I guess, the either fullness of Pocahontas in the painting and the more thinner. Oftentimes people will say she's more skeletal in the engraving. We have writing in both of these pieces, and the writing is incredibly important. And so when we do this compare and contrast, it's not enough to just think about the two images and thinking about similarities and differences. Because we are a history and biography museum, we have to have an end goal, a big so what. And for these two images, it's to determine which one came first. So which one is the portrait that's based from life? And I think that we have a poll for this. So which image came first? Is it the engraving or is it the painting? We're pretty evenly split. Okay, more people are saying the engraving now. Okay. Excellent. So we have about 2/3 of the audience saying the engraving came first and about 1/3 saying that the painting came first. But the question is, how do you know? Why do you think the engraving came first? Or why do you think that the painting came first? Miriam has noted that perhaps it's the expression. Again, getting back to this idea of color versus no color, Zarika mentions that she looks younger in the painting. And then Yanine mentions because of the information. And the information in the portrait, the words within the portrait, definitely give us a clue to how we know that the engraving came first. And so when we look at these two images, there are two clues, two reasons that we know. One, with the engraving, what you are seeing is a realistic representation of Pocahontas. This portrait is considered to be the only known likeness of her that was ever created. So you see these more Native American features, whereas in the painting, she has been anglicized or Europeanized. The other very important clue is actually a typo. I know that sounds crazy, but if you look at the very bottom of both the engraving and the painting, you'll see that it says, and I'll just read the whole thing so you can read along with me. Matoaka, which is Pocahontas's given name, alias Rebecca, which is her Christian name, daughter to the mighty Prince Powhatan, Emperor of the Algonquin of Virginia, converted and baptized in the Christian faith, and wife to the worthy Mr. John Rolfe. That's what it says in the engraving. But if you look over at the painting, at the very bottom line, you see it says, wife to the worthy Mr. Thomas Rolfe. And so we know that John Rolfe was Pocahontas's husband, who was an English settler at Jamestown. And they went to England in 1616. So Pocahontas could be presented to court, also to raise money. But John Rolfe and Pocahontas, they had a son, and their son's name was Thomas. And so that very small typo is a very big clue that we know that the engraving came first. And of course, I'm seeing it mentioned in the chat box. One other comparison that you could make is with Disney's Pocahontas, which would change the conversation altogether. Okay, finally, our last portrait. I just want to touch on this very briefly. It's hard to do a puzzle activity in a webinar, so I just want to talk about it for a minute. One of the other activities that we like to use with very complex portraits, such as this one, is to create a photocopy of it and then to cut it up into pieces, like a puzzle. And so in your classroom, you might take this portrait and you might cut it up into, let's say, 10 pieces. And depending on the size of your class, each student will get a piece of the puzzle, or maybe 2 or 3 students will get a piece of the puzzle. And so the first activity that these students need to do is to simply identify what's going on in their specific piece of the puzzle. What do they think that they know? From there, the group comes back together, the class comes back together, and a conversation is had about each piece of the puzzle. So each student or group of students will present their piece of the puzzle to everybody else. But the key is that they're not showing their piece of the puzzle. All the other students need to rely on the verbal description from each of the students about their piece of the puzzle. And then after that, 2 very important questions are asked. 1, what do we think we know is going on in the portrait? And 2, what do we want to know? What don't we know? And this goes back to what Naomi had said before with the visible thinking. Harvard's Project Zero has created artful thinking routines. And one of the ones that I love, actually 2 of the ones that I love, are See, Think, Wonder, and then Think, Puzzle, Explore. And so I would strongly encourage you to look those up. And I can certainly send along the link for the name site as well. Okay, so after all of the students have described their piece of the puzzle, those 2 questions have been asked, the puzzle gets put together, and then it becomes a conversation about the interpretation of the portrait. Again, remember, there has to be the observation before the interpretation. And so if you look on the next slide, you'll just see a small sampling of some of the people and the objects that are represented within this portrait. That portrait is called Men of Progress. It dates from 1862, during the time of the Civil War in America, when the North and South were fighting. And so the people that are represented are 19 American scientists and inventors that were really changing the course of our country during this era in history. And so you see these scientists, these inventors, with their inventions, which is a fantastic way to read the image. And then here's just the other objects, the other inventions that are found within the portrait. So I know that that was quick from all of us, but I hope that we provided some inspiration, some ideas for thinking about using objects, using artwork in the classroom, as well as thinking about the online resources of the Smithsonian. And one final slide from me. These are the strategies that we touched on, but in the Reading Portraiture Guide for Educators that you have on the Ning site, there are other strategies as well that you can use with your students. And then two final links from me to classroom resources on the Portrait Gallery site, as well as exhibitions that we've had in the gallery that we've placed online and associated lesson plans.
Wonderful. Thank you so much to both Brianna and Naomi for sharing their strategies from their museums. We got a chance to look at both object analysis as well as reading portraiture. If anyone has any questions, you can ask us both in the chat as well as through the Ning site. We'll be monitoring some of the discussion there. I also wanted to mention that while a lot of our examples had to do with American history, these strategies are obviously things that you
Thank you so much for joining us today, Ashley, Naomi, and Brianna. We really appreciate your taking the time to share these great resources with us, as well as some wonderful ideas and strategies for using these resources in our language learning.